March 3, 1933. A mobster walked into Stephanie St. Clair's office demanding $10,000 protection money. He brought 2 armed men and a smirk. She made 3 phone calls. 72 hours later, his boss was begging her to stop. March 3, 1933. 3:15 p.m. The afternoon light came through the windows of 409 Edgecombe Avenue at an angle that made the mahogany desk glow like polished bronze. Stephanie St. Clair sat behind it, fountain pen in hand, reviewing the morning's number slips from her runners across Harlem. Lenox Avenue had pulled in $847. 8th Avenue $1,203. 135th Street, nearly $2,000. Good numbers for a Tuesday. The Depression was crushing most of America, but in Harlem, hope still cost a nickel and came with 3 digits. The door opened without a knock. 3 men walked in like they owned the building. The first was tall, maybe 6'2", with slick back hair and a gray suit that cost more than most Harlem families made in 6 months. Sal Marinelli. Stephanie knew the name, a mid-level enforcer for the Genovese crime family, the kind of man who collected debts and broke fingers when collections ran late. The 2 men behind him were younger, wider, with their hands in their coat pockets. Gun hands. Marinelli smiled. It wasn't friendly. Madame St. Clair, he said, pronouncing her name wrong, making it sound like St. Clair, instead of the French way she'd been called since Martinique. We need to talk business. Stephanie set down her pen. She didn't stand. She didn't invite them to sit. She looked at Marinelli the way you'd look at a stain on expensive fabric. Something unpleasant that would need to be handled. My office hours are by appointment, she said. Her voice carried the faint trace of her Caribbean accent, softened by 21 years in Harlem but never fully gone. You don't have one. Marinelli's smile widened. He walked to the edge of her desk, placed both palms flat on the polished wood, and leaned forward like he was explaining something to a child. Here's how this works, sweetheart. Harlem's a big place. Lot of money moving around. Numbers, gambling, all that. You've done good for yourself. I respect that. But things are changing. You want to keep operating, you need protection. Real protection. The kind that keeps your runners safe. Keeps your collection houses from burning down. You understand what I'm saying? Stephanie's expression didn't change. She reached for a leather-bound ledger on the corner of her desk, opened it to a blank page and picked up her pen again. How much? She asked. Marinelli straightened up, pleased. 10,000. Monthly. First payment due Friday. That's 48 hours. Plenty of time to get your affairs in order. $10,000, Stephanie repeated, writing the figure in neat script. Monthly. That's right. And who do I make this protection payment to? The Genovese family. You'll deal with me directly. Stephanie wrote that down too. Then she looked up, her dark eyes steady on Marinelli's face. And what happens if I decline? One of the men behind Marinelli shifted his weight. His hand moved slightly inside his coat pocket. Marinelli's smile turned colder. Lady, you don't want to decline. You've got a nice setup here. Nice apartment. Nice business. Be a shame if something happened to it. Or to you. The room was very quiet. Outside, a streetcar rattled past on St. Nicholas Avenue. Somewhere in the building, a radio played jazz, Duke Ellington maybe, or Fletcher Henderson. Stephanie set her pen down again. She folded her hands on the desk and looked at Marinelli like she was studying something fascinating and slightly tragic. Mr. Marinelli, she said slowly, you've made a mistake. Marinelli laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. Yeah. What mistake is that? You walked into my office. You threatened my business. You threatened me. And you did it without understanding who I am, what I control, or what happens to men who underestimate me. The smile faded from Marinelli's face. You got 48 hours, lady. I don't care who you think you are. Friday, 3 p.m. you have $10,000 cash or we come back. And next time we won't be asking nice. He turned and walked toward the door. His 2 men followed, hands still in their pockets, eyes on Stephanie until they backed out into the hallway. The door closed. Stephanie sat in the silence for 10 seconds. Then she reached for the telephone on her desk, a black rotary model, one of 3 phone lines she kept active at all times. She didn't dial immediately. First, she opened the center drawer of her desk and pulled out a thick manila folder. Inside, photographs, bank records, witness statements, carefully documented evidence she'd been collecting for 9 months. Information about Genovese family operations in Harlem. Names, dates, locations, dollar amounts. She'd been waiting for the right moment to use it. Sal Marinelli had just given it to her. She picked up the phone and dialed the first number. Martinique. A girl named Stephanie watched French colonizers walk past her family's small house like they owned the air itself. They did, in a way. They owned the island, the sugar plantations, the docks, the future. They owned everything except the quiet rage that built in the chest of a girl who understood, even then, that power wasn't about being born into it. It was about taking it and never letting go. 26 years later, Stephanie St. Clair stepped off a steamship at Ellis Island with $43 sewn into the lining of her coat and a single certainty. America would not break her the way Martinique had tried to. Harlem, 1912, was a neighborhood in transition. Black families were moving in. White families were moving out. Rents were high, jobs were scarce, and the promise of the Great Migration was still a whisper, not yet a flood. Stephanie found work as a seamstress, then as a domestic servant for wealthy white families on the Upper East Side. She cleaned their houses, pressed their clothes, served their meals, and listened. She learned how money moved, how power worked, how the people who had everything always wanted more, and the people who had nothing were willing to risk everything for a chance. By 1920, Stephanie St. Clair owned the most lucrative illegal lottery operation in Harlem. The numbers racket, that's what people called it. A simple system. You picked 3 numbers, placed your bet with a runner, and if your numbers hit based on the published racetrack results or stock exchange figures, you won. Odds were terrible, payouts ranged from 600 to 1 down to lower tiers, but for Harlem residents making $8 a week scrubbing floors or hauling freight, a nickel bet was hope you could hold in your hand. Most operators ran dirty games. They rigged results, shortchanged winners, used violence to intimidate anyone who complained. Stephanie did the opposite. She paid out fairly, every time, no exceptions. If you won, you got your money within 24 hours. If her runners cheated, she fired them publicly and compensated the victims out of her own pocket. Within 3 years, she had 200 runners working for her across Harlem, generating $47,000 per month. In 1923 dollars. During a depression. She wasn't just running a numbers game. She was building an empire. 409 Edgecombe Avenue became her headquarters, a 6-story apartment building on Sugar Hill, the most prestigious address in Black America. Langston Hughes lived 2 blocks away. W.E.B. Du Bois lived 3. Thurgood Marshall would move in a few years later. Stephanie's apartment was on the 4th floor. High ceilings, parquet floors, French furniture shipped from Martinique, and 3 telephone lines that never stopped ringing. One for business. One for emergencies. One that only 6 people in Harlem had the number to. By March 1933, Stephanie St. Clair was 47 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, and never seen in public without tailored clothing that cost more than most men's monthly salaries. She favored fur coats in winter, silk dresses in summer, and always, a strand of pearls that had belonged to her grandmother. She carried a .32 caliber revolver in her purse, though she'd only fired it twice in her life. Once at a firing range in 1925 to prove she knew how, and once in 1929 to put a warning shot through the window of a crooked police captain's car. She was fluent in French, English, and the unspoken language of leverage. People called her Queenie or Madame St. Clair, depending on how much respect they wanted to show. To her face, everyone showed respect. Her power didn't come from muscle. She employed enforcers, men like Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, who'd started working for her in 1930 as a young street tough with a sharp mind and a reputation for loyalty. But violence was a tool of last resort for Stephanie, not a first response. Her real weapons were information, patience, and an intelligence network that reached into every corner of Harlem and beyond. She knew which police captains were taking bribes and from whom. She knew which judges had gambling debts. She knew which politicians were sleeping with their secretaries and which mafia soldiers were skimming from their bosses. She knew because she paid people to know, not just her runners but shopkeepers, cab drivers, janitors, secretaries, bartenders. The invisible people who saw everything and were never noticed. And she remembered everything. Every favor. Every slight. Every threat. By 1933 she'd already survived 3 attempts by white gangsters to take over her operation. The first was in 1928, 2 Irish mobsters from the West Side who thought a black woman couldn't possibly be running a $1 million operation without a man behind her. They demanded a meeting. She'd brought bank records showing exactly how much she made and legal documents proving she owned every building her runners operated from. When they tried intimidation, she'd pulled out photographs of them meeting with known communists, a career-ending accusation in 1928 America. They'd left Harlem and never came back. The second attempt was in 1930, A local Harlem operator named Wilfred Brunder who thought he could undercut her prices and steal her customers. Stephanie didn't threaten him. She bought the building he lived in, tripled his rent, and then offered to lower it back to normal if he agreed to work for her instead of against her. He agreed. He was still working for her in 1933. The third attempt was ongoing. Dutch Schultz. Arthur Flegenheimer, better known as Dutch Schultz, was a Bronx-born bootlegger who'd made millions during Prohibition and was now looking to expand into gambling. He wanted Harlem. He wanted the numbers racket. And he wanted Stephanie St. Clair out of the way. By 1931 he'd started pressuring her runners, undercutting her odds, using violence to intimidate her operators. Stephanie fought back with newspapers. She took out full-page advertisements in the New York Amsterdam News, Harlem's most widely read black newspaper, detailing Dutch Schultz's operations, naming corrupt police officers who protected him, and publishing evidence of his tax evasion. She turned Dutch Schultz from an invisible criminal into a public target. When his men beat up one of her runners, she didn't send enforcers. She sent lawyers and reporters. When he threatened her directly, she published his home address and phone number in the newspaper with the headline, "If anything happens to me, ask this man why." It was strategic warfare. And it worked. By March 1933, Dutch Schultz still wanted Harlem, but he knew Stephanie St. Clair wasn't someone you could simply muscle out. She had something more dangerous than guns. She had legitimacy, community support, and the ability to make your crimes public. That's what made Sal Marinelli's visit so stunning. The Genovese family knew who Stephanie was. They knew her history. They knew what happened to people who underestimated her. And yet Marinelli had walked into her office like she was just another shopkeeper who'd fold under pressure. It was disrespect. It was gendered. It was racial. And it was a mistake. Stephanie sat at her desk after Marinelli left, the telephone receiver cool against her ear as the first call connected. Outside her window, Harlem moved through its late afternoon rhythms. Children playing stickball on 145th Street. Women hanging laundry from fire escapes. Men gathering outside the barbershop on the corner, talking about Joe Louis's last fight or whether Roosevelt's New Deal would ever reach black folks. This was her neighborhood. Her people. Her empire. And nobody, not Dutch Schultz, not the NYPD, and certainly not some second-rate Genovese enforcer, was going to take it from her. The phone clicked. A voice answered. Amsterdam News City Desk. "James," Stephanie said, her voice calm and even. "It's Stephanie St. Clair. I have a story for you. Front page. And you'll want to sit down before I tell you what it's about." She'd been waiting 9 months for the right moment to use the evidence in her manila folder. Sal Marinelli had just given her that moment. And now she was going to destroy him. March 3, 1933. 4:47 p.m. The first call. Stephanie listened to the ring, 1, 2, 3 before James Hicks picked up. He was a city desk reporter at the New York Amsterdam News, 28 years old, Columbia educated, and hungry for stories that white newspapers wouldn't touch. Stephanie had been feeding him information for 5 years. Police corruption. Housing discrimination. Stories that mattered to Harlem but were invisible to the rest of New York. Amsterdam News City Desk. "James," Stephanie said. "It's Stephanie St. Clair. I have a story for you. Front page. And you'll want to sit down before I tell you what it's about." There was a pause. She heard him pull a chair closer, the scratch of a pencil being picked up. "I'm listening." The Genovese crime family is moving into Harlem. Not just watching from a distance, actively moving in. Extortion, protection rackets, threats against legitimate black-owned businesses and operations. I have names, dates, locations, dollar amounts. I have photographs of their enforcers meeting with NYPD officers from the 28th Precinct. I have bank records showing payoffs. And I have witnesses willing to go on record. The pencil stopped scratching. "Stephanie," James said carefully, "this is Genovese we're talking about. These aren't street thugs. This is organized crime at the highest level. If I print this." "If you print this," Stephanie interrupted, her voice calm but edged with steel, "you'll be the first Negro reporter to expose Italian mob operations with evidence they can't deny. You'll have documents, photographs, and testimony. This isn't speculation, James. This is fact. And if you don't print it, I'll take it to the New York Age or the Chicago Defender. Your choice." Another pause. Longer this time. "What do you need from me?" "I need you ready to publish within 72 hours. I'll have the full package delivered to your office by tomorrow morning. Everything organized, sourced, ready for print. But I need your word that you won't sit on this. 48 hours from now, I want every Negro in Harlem to know that the Italian Mafia thinks they can walk into our neighborhood and demand tribute like we're still on the plantation. She heard him exhale slowly. You're going to war. I've been at war since 1912, Stephanie said. This is just another battle. Do I have your word? You have my word. Good. Expect a delivery tomorrow at 9 a.m. Photographs, affidavits, financial records. Everything you need. She hung up before he could ask more questions. The manila folder sat open on her desk. 9 months of work. She'd started gathering this information in June 1932, when she'd first heard rumors that the Genovese family was eyeing Harlem's numbers racket. She'd sent runners to photograph Genovese enforcers. She'd paid building superintendents to note which apartments they visited. She'd bribed a bank clerk to make copies of suspicious wire transfers. She'd interviewed shopkeepers who'd been approached with protection offers. Marinelli's face was in 3 of the photographs, standing outside the Cotton Club in November, meeting with a 28th Precinct sergeant in December, collecting cash from a Lenox Avenue shopkeeper in January. She'd been building a case. Now she was going to use it. 6:23 p.m. The second call. Stephanie dialed a number she'd memorized but rarely used. A direct line that bypassed the main switchboard at the 28th Precinct and rang in a small office on the second floor. It rang 7 times before someone picked up. Harris. Detective William Harris. 34 years old, 12 years on the force and on Stephanie's payroll for 4 of them. She paid him $200 a month, more than his police salary, in exchange for information and, when necessary, strategic blindness. He wasn't the only cop she owned, but he was the most useful. He had access to arrest records, surveillance reports, and precinct gossip that let Stephanie know which operations were being watched and which officers were taking money from whom. Detective Harris, Stephanie said. This is Stephanie St. Clair. We need to talk. She heard him shift in his chair, lower his voice. This isn't a good time. Make it a good time, Stephanie said, her tone sharpening just enough to remind him who paid his rent. 3 hours ago, a man named Sal Marinelli walked into my office with 2 armed men and demanded $10,000 a month in protection money. Genovese family. You know him? Silence. I asked you a question, detective. I know him, Harris said quietly. He's been operating in Harlem for about 6 weeks. Mostly shaking down smaller operations. Liquor, gambling, couple of nightclubs. And you didn't think to tell me this? I didn't think he'd be stupid enough to come after you. Stephanie allowed herself a small, cold smile. Neither did I. But he was. And now I have a question for you, William. A very simple question. She opened the folder again, pulled out a specific photograph and held it up to the light. Black and white, slightly grainy but clear enough. Taken outside the Cotton Club on November 18, 1932, at 11:34 p.m. Detective William Harris accepting a thick envelope from Sal Marinelli. Both men smiling. Both men visible in profile. On November 18th of last year, Stephanie said slowly, you were photographed accepting money from Sal Marinelli outside the Cotton Club. I have the negative. I have the date and time stamps. I have the photographer's affidavit. And I have 3 witnesses who saw the exchange and are willing to testify under oath that you have been providing protection to Genovese operations in exchange for cash payments. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Now, Stephanie continued, her voice dropping to something softer, almost conversational, I'm going to ask you a question and you're going to answer it very carefully. Which side will you be on when this goes public? Jesus Christ, Stephanie. Answer the question. She heard him breathing. Heard the scrape of a match being lit, the draw of a cigarette, the exhale. What do you want? Harris asked finally. I want you to make a choice. Right now. Tonight. You can stay on Marinelli's payroll, protect Genovese interests, and hope they're generous when I release evidence of your corruption to the district attorney, the mayor's office, and every newspaper in the city. Or. She paused, let the word hang. Or. Harris prompted. Or you can remember that you've been working for me longer than you've been working for them. You can provide me with every piece of information you have on Marinelli's operations in Harlem, where he's staying, who he reports to, what his orders are, which other officers are involved. You can distance yourself from Genovese operations starting tonight. And you can make sure that when the 28th Precinct is asked to investigate Italian mob activity in Harlem, you're on the right side of that investigation. And if I do that? Then the photograph stays in my desk. The witnesses forget what they saw. And you keep collecting your $200 a month, same as always. Another long silence. How much time do I have? You have until I hang up this phone, Stephanie said. Choose. She heard him curse under his breath. Heard the cigarette being crushed out in an ashtray. What do you need to know? Stephanie picked up her pen. Everything. For the next 18 minutes, Detective William Harris told her everything. Marinelli was staying at a brownstone on West 140th Street, owned by a Genovese front company. He reported directly to Vincent Romano, a family captain who oversaw Harlem operations. He'd been authorized to collect protection payments from smaller operations but had been explicitly told to avoid Stephanie St. Clair. Orders he'd ignored because he thought a woman wouldn't fight back. 3 other 28th Precinct officers were on Genovese payroll. Sergeant Dennis Murphy, Officer Frank Costa, Officer Raymond Blake. Marinelli's next move was a raid on Stephanie's main collection house on Friday night. He planned to seize cash and records to prove she couldn't protect her operation. Stephanie wrote it all down. One more thing, Harris said. Romano doesn't know Marinelli came after you. This was Marinelli freelancing trying to prove himself. If Romano finds out, Marinelli's finished. Good to know, Stephanie said. Stay close to your phone, detective. I may need you before this is over. She hung up. 2 calls down. 1 to go. 9:15 p.m. The third call. This one required more precision. Stephanie didn't have a direct number. She had to go through a secretary, then a junior associate, then finally reach the man she needed. It took 11 minutes of polite waiting, listening to hold silence before the voice came on the line. Feldman. Lawrence Feldman. Senior partner at Feldman and Associates, a white shoe law firm with offices in Midtown Manhattan. 46 years old, Harvard Law, represented some of the most powerful legitimate businesses in New York. Also represented, through carefully structured shell companies and subsidiary arrangements, several of the Genovese family's real estate holdings. Stephanie had never spoken to him directly before, but she knew exactly who he was. Mr. Feldman, she said, her voice professional, almost pleasant. My name is Stephanie St. Clair. I run a financial services operation in Harlem. I'm calling because I believe we have a mutual concern regarding certain business interests you represent. I don't know who you are, Feldman said coldly, and I don't know how you got this number, but you represent Apex Realty Corporation, Consolidated Property Holdings, and Riverside Development Group, Stephanie interrupted smoothly. All 3 companies are registered to the same 5th Avenue address as your firm. All 3 companies own property in Harlem. And all 3 companies are, to my knowledge, wholly owned subsidiaries of interests associated with the Genovese crime family. Am I mistaken? The line went very quiet. Who is this? Feldman asked again, slower now, carefully. I told you. My name is Stephanie St. Clair. And I have documents, financial records, wire transfer receipts, property deeds, that show systematic money laundering through those 3 companies. Income from illegal gambling, bootlegging, and extortion being funneled through Harlem real estate purchases, then declared as legitimate rental income. Clean money from dirty sources. The kind of thing that would interest the Internal Revenue Service tremendously. She heard him breathing on the other end. Heard papers being moved. What do you want? Feldman asked. I want you to deliver a message to your clients. Today, a man named Sal Marinelli, an enforcer working for Vincent Romano, entered my place of business and demanded protection payments. $10,000 per month. He threatened violence if I refused. He gave me 48 hours to comply. And I'm giving you 72 hours to recall him. Permanently. Remove him from Harlem, and his operations in my territory, and make it clear to Vincent Romano that any further attempts to extort, threaten, or interfere with my business will result in me releasing every document I have to the IRS, the district attorney, and the New York Times. You're bluffing. I don't bluff, Mr. Feldman. I prepare. I've been documenting Genovese real estate operations for 9 months. I have bank records showing cash deposits that don't match declared income. I have witness testimony from building superintendents, tenants, and contractors who can testify where the money came from. I have photographs of your clients meeting with known criminals. And I have copies of everything stored in 3 separate locations, with instructions to release them if anything happens to me. She paused to let that sink in. 72 hours, she repeated. That's until Monday, March 6th at 3 p.m. If Sal Marinelli is still operating in Harlem after that deadline, I make 1 phone call and the IRS starts an audit that will dismantle every legitimate business your clients have built in the last 10 years. Tax evasion is federal jurisdiction, Mr. Feldman. Very hard to make that go away. You don't know what you're starting. I know exactly what I'm starting, Stephanie said quietly. I'm reminding your clients that Harlem isn't theirs to take. It's mine. And I protect what's mine. She hung up. The apartment was silent except for the distant sound of jazz from a radio 3 floors down. Stephanie sat at her desk, the 3 phone calls complete, and allowed herself a moment to breathe. She'd just declared war on the Genovese crime family. Not with guns. With information. Now she waited to see if they were smart enough to recognize when they'd lost. March 4, 1933. 10:23 a.m. Sal Marinelli came back. He didn't knock this time either. Just walked through the door of Stephanie's office like he'd already won, like the 48 hours he'd given her had already expired and she'd made her choice. He brought 4 men this time instead of 2. Bigger men. Men whose suits barely contained the width of their shoulders and whose hands stayed in their coat pockets with obvious intent. Stephanie was reading the morning edition of the Amsterdam News. She didn't look up. You got my message? Marinelli asked, standing in front of her desk. I did. And I told you yesterday. You've made a mistake. Marinelli's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, placed both hands flat on her desk. The same gesture he'd used the day before, the one meant to intimidate. Let me make something real clear, lady. I know where you live. 409 Edgecombe, 4th floor. I know you walk to church every Sunday at Abyssinian Baptist, 10 o'clock service. I know you got runners working out of 23 locations across Harlem. I know you collect on Fridays. And I know you think you're protected because you got some cops on payroll and some Negro newspaper that'll print whatever you tell them. He straightened up, smiled without warmth. But here's what you don't know. We got more cops than you do. We got more muscle than you do. And we got patience. So you can make this easy or you can make it hard. But either way, come Friday at 3 p.m. you're gonna pay. Or we're gonna start breaking things. Starting with your collection house on Lenox Avenue. Stephanie set down the newspaper. She looked at Marinelli with the same calm, analytical expression she'd worn the day before, like she was watching something predictable happen exactly as she'd expected. Friday at 3 p.m., she repeated. Lenox Avenue. That's right. Thank you for confirming that. Marinelli's smile faltered slightly. Confirming what? That you're planning to raid my collection house. That's valuable information. The 4 men behind Marinelli shifted slightly, glancing at each other. Marinelli's face darkened. You think this is a game? No, Stephanie said quietly. I think this is a miscalculation. And I think by Monday you're going to understand exactly how badly you've miscalculated. Marinelli stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked toward the door, his men following. At the threshold he stopped and looked back. You got 36 hours left, Madame St. Clair. Use them wisely. The door slammed shut. Stephanie waited 10 seconds. Then she picked up the phone. What Marinelli didn't see, what he couldn't see because he didn't understand how Stephanie's empire actually worked, was the network already moving around him. Within 15 minutes of Marinelli's exit, 6 people knew what had happened. Bumpy Johnson got the call at 10:41 a.m. He was 26 years old in 1933, already building a reputation as the most reliable enforcer in Harlem, and he'd been working for Stephanie for 3 years. He arrived at her office at 11 a.m. sharp, 6-foot frame filling the doorway, his expression calm but ready. You want him gone? Bumpy asked. Not yet, Stephanie said. I want him watched. Every move. Where he goes, who he meets, what he says. I want to know before he knows. Bumpy nodded once. I'll put 3 men on him. Good. And Bumpy, no violence unless I authorize it. I want information, not bodies. Understood. Clara Washington got the call at 10:45 a.m. She ran a boarding house on West 140th Street, the same block where Marinelli was staying. She was 62 years old, had lived in Harlem since 1905, and had been feeding Stephanie information for 8 years. Stephanie paid her $50 a month to keep her eyes open and her mouth shut. Clara, Stephanie said, the Italian's staying in the brownstone 3 doors down from you. Sal Marinelli. I need to know his schedule. When he leaves, when he comes back, if anyone visits him. I already been watching him, baby, Clara said. Her voice was warm, grandmotherly, but sharp underneath. He leaves every morning at 9, comes back around midnight. Yesterday he had 2 visitors. Both white men looked like police to me. Plain clothes, but that walk, you know? That cop walk. Good. Keep watching. Call me if anything changes. You got trouble, baby? Nothing I can't handle. Reverend Marcus Gaines got the call at 11:03 a.m. He was the assistant pastor at Abyssinian Baptist Church, 38 years old, and one of the few people in Harlem who knew the full extent of Stephanie's operations. She'd funded the church's expansion in 1929 with a $20,000 donation. No strings attached, no publicity. The congregation knew her as a generous member. Reverend Gaines knew her as the woman who kept half of Harlem employed when white businesses wouldn't hire Negro workers. "Reverend," Stephanie said, "I need a favor." "Name it." "Sunday service tomorrow. I need you to mention casually that Harlem is our neighborhood, our community, and that any outsiders who come here trying to take what we've built, they're not welcome." There was a pause. "You want me to preach about protecting Harlem?" "I want you to remind people that we protect each other. No specific names. No specific threats. Just a reminder that this neighborhood belongs to us, and we don't bow to outside pressure." "You're preparing people." "I'm reminding people," Stephanie corrected. "There's a difference." "I'll do it," Reverend Gaines said. "But Stephanie, be careful. Whatever you're fighting, don't fight it alone." "I'm not alone, Reverend. I've got all of Harlem." By Saturday evening, March 4th, Stephanie had a complete intelligence picture. Bumpy's men reported that Marinelli had met with 328th Precinct officers at a diner on 125th Street at 2 p.m. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Cash changed hands. One of the officers, Sergeant Dennis Murphy, had driven Marinelli back to the brownstone on 140th Street and stayed inside for another hour. Clara Washington reported that Marinelli received a phone call at 7:30 p.m. that lasted less than 2 minutes. Afterward, he'd left the building in a hurry, returned 20 minutes later with a newspaper, and stayed inside the rest of the night. Detective William Harris called at 9:47 p.m. with an update. "Murphy's putting together a raid team," Harris said quietly. "Friday night, like Marinelli said. 8 officers, all on Genovese payroll. They're going to hit your Lenox Avenue location at midnight, seize whatever cash is there, arrest your runners on gambling charges. Make it look legitimate." "Can you stop it?" "Not without exposing myself. But I can make sure you know exactly when they're coming." "That's enough," Stephanie said. "Thank you, William." And at 10:15 p.m. the phone rang one final time. It was James Hicks from the Amsterdam News. "I've got the story laid out," he said. His voice was tight with controlled excitement. "Photographs, documents, testimony, everything you gave me. This is explosive, Stephanie. Front page above the fold. But I need to ask, are you sure about this? Once this prints, there's no taking it back." "I'm sure." "When do you want it to run?" Stephanie looked at the calendar on her desk. Today was Saturday, March 4th. Marinelli's deadline was Friday, March 10th, 6 days away. But she didn't need 6 days. She needed 72 hours. "Hold the story until Monday morning," she said. March 6th. "I want it on every doorstep in Harlem by sunrise." "Monday it is." Stephanie hung up and leaned back in her chair. Marinelli thought he was applying pressure. He thought showing up with more men, making more threats, confirming his plans would force her to capitulate. He didn't understand that every word he'd spoken, every move he'd made, had given her exactly what she needed: confirmation, patterns, evidence. He was still thinking like a bully. Stephanie was thinking like a strategist. Outside her window, Harlem settled into its Saturday night rhythms. Music drifted from the Renaissance Ballroom 4 blocks south. Laughter echoed from the speakeasies that hadn't quite disappeared despite Prohibition's official end. Somewhere, a woman sang a blues song that made the air feel heavy with longing. This was her city, her people, her kingdom. And on Monday morning, Sal Marinelli was going to learn what it cost to threaten a queen. March 6, 1933. 10:17 a.m. The phone rang. Stephanie knew who it was before she picked up. She'd been waiting for this call since Saturday night, since the moment she'd set everything in motion. She let it ring twice more, not from nervousness but from control. Let them wait. Let them understand that she operated on her schedule, not theirs. She picked up on the 5th ring. Stephanie St. Clair. The voice on the other end was tight, controlled, layered with the kind of restraint that came from swallowing rage. "Mrs. St. Clair. My name is Vincent Romano. I believe we need to meet." "Not Marinelli. His boss." Stephanie allowed herself the smallest smile. "Mr. Romano. I've been expecting your call." "I'm sure you have." His voice was smooth now, carefully professional. "There's been a misunderstanding. A significant misunderstanding. I'd like the opportunity to discuss it in person." "When?" "Today. 2 o'clock. Rouse Restaurant, 114th Street. You know it?" She knew it. Italian restaurant, family-owned, East Harlem. Neutral territory technically, though it was closer to Genovese operations than hers. That he was suggesting it meant something. He wanted to meet on familiar ground but not so deep in his territory that it would look like a summons. He was being careful. That meant he was worried. I know it, Stephanie said. I'll be there. Come alone. No, Stephanie said simply. I'll bring one associate. Unarmed. You can bring whoever you want. There was a pause. Then, fair enough. 2 o'clock. The line went dead. Stephanie set the phone down and looked at the morning edition of the Amsterdam News spread across her desk. The headline was 3 inches tall, bold black ink that screamed across the front page. Italian mob moves into Harlem. Genovese family extortion racket exposed. Photos. Documents reveal police corruption. Below the headline were 2 photographs. The first showed Sal Marinelli outside the Cotton Club, shaking hands with Sergeant Dennis Murphy, cash visible between their palms. The second showed a group of men, Marinelli included, standing outside a brownstone on 140th Street. James Hicks had done exactly what she'd asked. The story was devastating. Names, dates, locations, dollar amounts. Everything documented, everything sourced. By noon, every Negro in Harlem would know that the Italian Mafia had tried to move into their neighborhood. And every white politician in City Hall would know that the NYPD's 28th precinct was compromised. Stephanie picked up the phone again and dialed. Bumpy, she said when he answered, I need you at Rouse at 2 o'clock. Suit and tie. No weapons. What's happening? Vincent Romano wants to talk. There was a pause. You want me armed anyway? No. This isn't that kind of meeting. But I want you there so they know I don't come alone. I'll be ready. 2 p.m. Rouse was a narrow restaurant tucked between a butcher shop and a bakery on 114th Street, just east of Pleasant Avenue. Red checkered tablecloths, the smell of garlic and tomato sauce, photographs of Italian villages on the walls. A place where wise guys ate Sunday dinner with their families and settled disputes over wine and pasta. When Stephanie walked in, every conversation stopped. She wore a charcoal gray suit, tailored perfectly, with a silk blouse the color of cream and her grandmother's pearls. Her hair was pinned up beneath a small hat. She carried a black leather handbag and walked like she owned the building. Bumpy Johnson followed 2 steps behind, 26 years old and imposing in a dark suit that made his shoulders look even broader. His face was calm, expressionless, but his eyes moved constantly, noting exits, counting men, calculating angles. A man in a white apron approached immediately. Mrs. St. Clair? Yes. This way, please. He led them to the back of the restaurant, through a kitchen thick with steam and the clatter of pots, and into a private room. A single table covered with a white cloth. 4 chairs. A window that looked out onto a narrow alley. 2 men were already seated. Vincent Romano was in his early 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most Harlem families made in a year. He had the kind of face that looked permanently tired, heavy-lidded eyes, deep lines around the mouth, but his posture was sharp, attentive. This was a man who'd spent 30 years in organized crime and survived by being smarter than the people around him. Next to him sat another man younger, maybe 40, with a boxer's flattened nose and hands that looked like they'd broken bones. Muscle, not management. Romano stood when Stephanie entered. The other man didn't. Mrs. St. Clair, Romano said, gesturing to the chair across from him. Thank you for coming. Stephanie sat. Bumpy remained standing behind her, hands clasped in front of him. Romano gestured to his companion. This is Tony Vaccaro. He handles security for our operations. Stephanie nodded once but didn't extend a hand. Neither did Vaccaro. For a moment no one spoke. The only sound was the muffled noise of the kitchen beyond the door. Romano folded his hands on the table. I'll be direct, he said. Sal Marinelli acted without authorization. His approach to you, his demands, none of that was sanctioned by me or by anyone in our organization. It was freelance stupidity and I apologize for it. Apologies are appreciated, Stephanie said calmly. But they don't address the situation. No, Romano agreed. They don't. Which is why I'm here to address it personally. He reached into his jacket pocket, slowly, carefully making it clear he wasn't reaching for a weapon, and pulled out a folded newspaper. The Amsterdam News. He placed it on the table between them. This, he said, tapping the headline, is a problem. For you, Stephanie said. For both of us, Romano corrected. You've just made our operations front page news. You've exposed officers we work with. You've given the district attorney's office ammunition they can use to justify investigations. You've painted a target on our backs. And you've painted a target on mine, Stephanie said, her voice cool. The moment Sal Marinelli walked into my office and threatened my business, my safety, and my people, you painted that target. I didn't start this, Mr. Romano. I'm finishing it. Romano's jaw tightened slightly. What do you want? Stephanie met his eyes without blinking. I want Sal Marinelli removed from Harlem. Permanently. I want confirmation that the Genovese family has no intention of expanding into my territory. I want a guarantee, one I can trust, that no one affiliated with your organization will threaten, extort, or interfere with my operations. And I want $15,000 in cash as compensation for the disruption, the threats, and the disrespect. Vaccaro leaned forward. You're out of your... Romano raised one hand, silencing him. 15,000, Romano repeated. That's correct. And in exchange? In exchange, Stephanie said, I delay releasing the additional documents I have. Bank records showing money laundering through your real estate holdings. Wire transfers that tie your legitimate businesses to illegal income. The kind of evidence that triggers IRS audits and federal investigations. She opened her handbag, pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table. It was a photocopy of a bank statement, Apex Realty Corporation, showing a wire transfer of $47,000 from an unlisted account. Romano looked at it for a long moment. You've been planning this, he said quietly. I've been preparing, Stephanie corrected. There's a difference. I prepare for every possibility, Mr. Romano. Including the possibility that someone would be foolish enough to underestimate me because I'm a woman or because I'm Negro. Marinelli made that mistake. I'm giving you the opportunity not to repeat it. Romano leaned back in his chair. He looked at Vaccaro, who shook his head slightly, disagreeing but deferring. Then he looked back at Stephanie. You understand that if I agree to this, it sets a precedent. It makes us look weak. It makes you look smart, Stephanie said. It shows you know the difference between a fight you can win and a fight that costs more than it's worth. My operations don't interfere with yours outside Harlem. I have no interest in expanding into Italian neighborhoods. I'm not a threat to you unless you make yourself a threat to me. Romano was silent for 10 seconds. 15. 20. Then he nodded once. Marinelli will be gone by tonight. You won't see him again. And the rest? You have my word. Harlem is yours. We won't interfere. And the 15,000? Romano's expression flickered. Annoyance, maybe, or respect. Hard to tell. I'll have it delivered to your office by Thursday. Tomorrow? Stephanie said. Romano's eyes narrowed. You don't trust my word? I trust actions, Mr. Romano. Words are easy. Cash is confirmation. Another long silence. Then Romano smiled, thin, humorless but genuine. You're a hard woman, Mrs. St. Clair. I'm a woman who protects what's hers, Stephanie said. She stood, smoothing her skirt. Thank you for the meeting, Mr. Romano. I hope we don't need to have another one. Romano stood as well. He extended his hand. Stephanie looked at it for a moment. Then she shook it, firm, brief, professional. One more thing, Romano said as she turned toward the door. The documents you have. The bank records, the wire transfers. If those ever become public. They won't, Stephanie said, glancing back, as long as we understand each other. She walked out, Bumpy following close behind. Outside, the March air was cold and sharp. Stephanie walked 2 blocks in silence before she spoke. It's done, she said quietly. You trust him? Bumpy asked. I trust that he's smart enough to know I wasn't bluffing. And I trust that losing face costs less than losing money. Bumpy nodded slowly. What about Marinelli? Marinelli's gone. Romano will handle that himself. They walked another block. Harlem stretched around them, storefronts, apartment buildings, people moving through their Monday afternoon routines. Her neighborhood. Her empire. You could have asked for more, Bumpy said. Stephanie smiled slightly. I didn't need more. I needed them to understand they couldn't take what was mine. That's worth more than money. They turned onto Edgecombe Avenue. Oh. Somewhere across the city, Sal Marinelli was learning what it cost to underestimate a queen. And Stephanie St. Clair, Caribbean immigrant, numbers queen, strategic genius, was already thinking 3 moves ahead. March 7, 1933. 4:32 p.m. The envelope arrived exactly when Vincent Romano said it would. A young man in a gray suit, Italian, mid-20s, nervous, knocked on Stephanie's office door and handed it to her without a word. Inside, $15,000 in $100 bills, counted and banded. No note. No explanation needed. Stephanie counted it twice, methodically, while the young man waited. When she finished, she nodded once. "Tell Mr. Romano we have an understanding." The young man left quickly, relief visible in his shoulders. Stephanie placed the money in her safe, locked it, and sat down at her desk. Outside her window, Harlem moved through its late afternoon rhythms. Children playing in the streets, women returning from day work in white households, men gathering outside barbershops and pool halls. The same rhythms that had existed yesterday, the same rhythms that would exist tomorrow. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. She picked up the telephone and made one final call. Amsterdam News City Desk. "James," Stephanie said. "It's Stephanie St. Clair. I need you to run a follow-up story." "Already working on it," James said. She could hear the smile in his voice. 3 NYPD officers from the 28th Precinct resigned this morning. No explanation given. Sergeant Dennis Murphy, Officer Frank Costa, Officer Raymond Blake. All 3 named in Saturday's story. The precinct captain issued a statement saying they're conducting an internal investigation into allegations of corruption. "Good," Stephanie said. "Make sure the story mentions that community pressure works. That when Harlem stands together we can push back against outside threats. I'll make sure it's in there." "Thank you, James." She hung up and leaned back in her chair. 3 police officers gone. Sal Marinelli recalled, permanently according to her sources. Clara Washington had reported that morning that the brownstone on 140th Street was empty, Marinelli's belongings cleared out overnight. The Genovese family had withdrawn from Harlem without firing a shot, without a single act of violence, because Stephanie had made it more expensive to stay than to leave. That's what strategy looked like. That's what power looked like. Not guns. Not muscle. Information, leverage, timing, and the willingness to go further than your opponent expected. Sunday, March 12, 1933. 10 a.m. Stephanie sat in the 3rd row of Abyssinian Baptist Church, same seat she'd occupied for 11 years. The morning light came through the stained-glass windows in shafts of gold and blue. The congregation filled every pew, 700 people dressed in their Sunday best, voices rising in hymns that made the walls vibrate. Reverend Marcus Gaines stood at the pulpit. "We live in difficult times," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the sanctuary. "The Depression has taken much from us. Jobs, homes, dignity. But it has not taken our community. It has not taken our strength. And it has not taken our ability to stand together when threats come from outside." He paused, let the words settle. "Last week, forces from outside Harlem tried to take what we've built. They came with threats and demands. They thought we would bow. They thought wrong." A murmur of agreement rippled through the congregation. Amens echoed from the back rows. "Because Harlem belongs to us," Reverend Gaines continued. "Not to outsiders who see us as targets. Not to those who think we're weak because of the color of our skin or because we're immigrants or because we've been pushed to the margins. We are not weak. We are not targets. We are a community. And when we stand together, no force on earth can break us." The congregation erupted in applause. Women waved their hands. Men stood. The sound filled the church like thunder. Stephanie didn't stand. She didn't applaud. She simply sat, hands folded in her lap, and allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. This was why she fought. Not for money, though money mattered. Not for power, though power was necessary. She fought because Harlem was hers to protect. Because 700 people sitting in this church and the thousands more across the neighborhood depended on her to hold the line against forces that would consume them without a second thought. She fought because no one else would. The legend of that week, the week Stephanie St. Clair made 3 phone calls and brought the Genovese family to its knees, spread through Harlem like fire through dry grass. In barbershops, men told the story of how Queenie faced down the Italian mafia without firing a shot. In beauty parlors, women whispered about the Caribbean immigrant who'd become more powerful than any man in Harlem. In speakeasies and numbers joints, runners and operators talked about the photographs, the newspaper exposés, the way she'd outthought, outmaneuvered, and outlasted men who should have crushed her. The story grew with each telling. Details changed, embellishments appeared, but the core remained. Stephanie St. Clair was untouchable. And for the next decade no one would dare forget it. Of course there would be other battles. Dutch Schultz wouldn't give up easily. His war with Stephanie would continue through 1934 and 1935, escalating until his murder in October 1935, a killing that sent shockwaves through organized crime. Legend says Stephanie sent him a telegram after he was shot. As ye sow, so shall ye reap. Whether she actually sent it remains disputed. But everyone believes she had. That's how powerful her reputation had become. There would be arrests. Stephanie was arrested dozens of times on gambling charges, but rarely convicted. She knew how to work the legal system, how to delay trials, how to make prosecutions more expensive than they were worth. There would be betrayals, close associates who turned, allies who sold information, lovers who disappointed her. There would be age, eventually. Time that even the most brilliant strategist couldn't outmaneuver. But in March 1933, Stephanie St. Clair was 47 years old and at the height of her power. She'd just proven, again, that intelligence mattered more than muscle, that a Caribbean woman could beat the Italian mafia at their own game, and that Harlem had a protector who would never back down. Stephanie St. Clair died on December 1, 1969, at the age of 83. By then the Harlem she'd known had changed. The numbers racket had been largely absorbed by larger criminal organizations. Urban renewal had destroyed blocks of the neighborhood. The Harlem Renaissance was a memory, its energy scattered. Mainstream newspapers barely noticed her passing. The New York Times ran a 4-sentence obituary buried on page 47. White historians ignored her. Academic studies of organized crime focused on Italian and Irish mobsters, rarely mentioning the black woman who'd held Harlem for 2 decades. But in Harlem, among the people who remembered, among the families whose rents she'd paid, among the churches she'd funded, among the runners she'd employed and protected, Stephanie St. Clair's name meant something. It meant strategic genius. It meant community protector. It meant a woman who refused to bow. It meant a Caribbean immigrant who came to America with nothing and built an empire through intelligence, patience, and an unshakable belief that she deserved respect. This is why her story matters. Not because she was violent, she rarely was. Not because she was ruthless, though she could be when necessary. But because she was smarter. Because she proved that power doesn't come from who's strongest or who has the most guns. Power comes from information, preparation, understanding leverage, and having the courage to use it. Because she was a black woman in Jim Crow America who made the mafia back down. Because she was an immigrant who turned Harlem into a kingdom and herself into a queen. Because when Sal Marinelli walked into her office demanding protection money, she didn't reach for a gun. She reached for a phone. And she changed everything.